With 2024 in the rearview mirror, I'd like to reflect on the year by talking about my top 5 titles of the past 12 months. It was a pretty solid year, all things considered, and my list reflects hundreds of hours of enjoyment across quite a few major titles. As always, this is my personal list and reflects no one's opinions but my own. Number 5. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I really loved FF7 Remake, which was a great feeling action game that also worked really well on a narrative level. It had a good level of commitment to the source material, while also striking out on some narrative pathways that signaled some big plot shifts. Of course, it didn't hurt that the game often looked superb, packing impressively modeled characters and good quality pre-calculated lighting. But Rebirth makes me feel a bit more mixed. The game has a lighter tone and a weaker narrative drive, which didn't work as well for me. Open world games aren't really my thing either, and the switch to a wider structure made the game feel a bit more aimless. There are a lot of minigames too, some of them pretty unsatisfying in my opinion. Plus the graphics technology hasn't totally kept pace. Cutscenes look better than ever, but the world no longer features detailed light maps, creating a lot of obvious lighting inaccuracies. Of course, a lot of these changes are derived from the source material, or at least motivated by it. And there are a lot of players who really like the middle portion of FF7, or whose sense of nostalgia is stronger than mine. But to me, this middle section is the least exciting portion of the remake trilogy's 3-part structure. For what it is though, I think Square Enix largely did a great job. The combat still feels amazing, the cutscene direction is impeccable, and the open world feels inviting, with a lot of interesting things to do. I think the side quests are actually kind of compelling here, which wasn't the case at all in my opinion in the prior title. There's so much to see and do and explore, and so many little plot and character moments that make up for it. And the PS5 Pro version addresses one key visual complaint from the original PS5 code, that the performance mode looked soft and low detail relative to current gen standards. By taking advantage of the Pro's larger GPU and Sony's PSSR upsampling technology, Square Enix delivers pretty credible 4K 60 gameplay, which feels and looks great. That's why FF7 Rebirth comes in at number 5 here. It's a game I really enjoyed, but it's also a game that I feel is probably better calibrated to appeal to certain other players. Number 4. Parking Garage Rally Circuit. This clearly named game is essentially an arcade racing title built on drifting that takes place in a series of parking garages. That may or may not sound terribly appealing, but the key here is that the game's developer has completely nailed the game's driving mechanics. The movement of the camera, momentum of the drifts, and suspension response of the cars feels just perfect on a gamepad right from the start. It bears some resemblance to older rally games, but the closest analog in my memory banks is actually Mario Kart DS, which has fairly similar drifting mechanics. Drifting into the direction of a turn builds boost, but counter-steering and snapping back gets you to the second boost level much more quickly. Once you let go and your vehicle straightens out, you get a satisfying speed bump, accompanied by a camera move and speed lines to accentuate the acceleration. The whole parking garage conceit seems strange, but it actually works pretty perfectly for a game like this. Parking garages provide tight turns and interesting obstacles to navigate, and it feels like there's a pretty much perfect marriage between the speed of the vehicles, drifting response, and track layouts. Certain liberties are taken with typical parking garage design, of course, and the tracks often snake out into larger, less claustrophobic environments for a change of pace between parking garage segments. For what the game is, I really don't have any complaints. It's well balanced, the controls are perfectly calibrated, and it's just a lot of fun. I also really like the game's visual design, which is inspired by visual conventions of the Sega Saturn, dithering and all. The whole experience was built by a solo developer in about a year, which is pretty remarkable considering the quality and mechanical polish of the whole experience. Every year I try to play most arcade racers of reasonable quality, and I often find games I like quite a bit, but Parking Garage Rally Circuit really stood out to me in 2024. In the near complete absence of AAA arcade racers, indie games like this are the only way this genre truly gets exercised. After all, I can only replay Dirt 5 or Wreckfest so many times before they get a little bit stale. Number 3. Metaphor ReFantazio. Though Metaphor is very distinct from the Shin Megami Tensei games, it bears a heavy resemblance to the Persona titles. It features social links, turn-based weakness-oriented combat, similar dungeon mechanics, and critically, very similar time management. The key point of differentiation comes down to setting. While the Persona games center on young people in high school settings, ReFantazio focuses on a kind of industrial fantasy setting instead. Combat also changes substantially in some respects from Persona, with an extra move system that is a little bit harder to game and some real-time combat elements. Persona is really the point of reference I'd settle on here, though the game's storyline diverges quite a bit from typical Persona fare. It's less fixated on interpersonal growth, character stories, and contemporary social themes, and tends to be oriented more towards an overarching larger story. The extent to which that suits your tastes is going to be a personal matter, but I've found the villain of the week and character of the week framing of Persona 5 in particular a little easier to relate to and follow. Metaphor does some very interesting things with its narrative though that are quite novel in their own right. My only real complaints about Metaphor ReFantazio have to center around certain elements of the game's visual presentation, which aren't really up to contemporary standards. PS5 Pro at least cleans up performance to an acceptable level for console players, though I've been playing more on PC personally. But no level of hardware grunt can improve lighting or asset quality with the unmodified game, which is an issue across all platforms. I'm putting this game at number 3 a little provisionally though, because I haven't progressed quite as far as I'd like, unlike the other titles on this list. It's hard to keep pace with a pretty difficult 80-hour game released towards the end of the year, factoring in my other obligations. But I've enjoyed everything I've played, and I'm looking forward to closing it out sometime in the new year. Number 2. Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 Reload is in a lot of respects a near-perfect remake. It takes the framework of the very successful and genre-establishing original and modernizes it for contemporary audiences. A lot of this is stuff you'd expect. The game's graphical presentation has been completely redone, with a striking new UI, remodeled characters and environments, and UE4-driven lighting. It has definite highs and lows, but it does generally look a lot more appealing than its PS2-powered predecessor. The game's interface is also much more intuitive and convenient to use. Persona 3's combat hasn't aged very well though, so that gets essentially a full reworking in line with more modern turn-based Atlas titles. Characters can shift, passing off their turn after scoring a critical hit or striking a weakness, and have access to dramatic theurgy attacks that charge up over time. Plus, all characters are directly controllable, which wasn't the case in the original game. And there are a bunch of smaller changes. Fuka has her own SP bar and can execute her own abilities. Light and dark skills have been added to the game, and combat has been completely rebalanced from top to bottom. I think it's the best combat in any Persona title to date, and it feels satisfying throughout, which is helped enormously by the captivating new combat animations. There are a ton of other little functional changes and additions throughout the rest of the game, like the new social activities you can engage in with the members of SEAS, which can confer some pretty big combat benefits if you progress far enough. The story is essentially the same as the original, but the script has been rewritten and new scenes have been added throughout the game. All the music has been re-recorded, with some excellent new songs in the mix as well. That might not sound very exciting on the surface, but the combination of all those changes and improvements on top of the original work really make the game shine. It's just a really finely tuned remake that understands its audience very well. I've played the original before, so I didn't get any big story surprises, but there's something special about the way the game's story is presented to the player in Reload. It's such a satisfying and emotional game that really connects on a level that few other games can manage. A lot of games indulge in grand, world-spanning plots, and Persona is like that on some level, but it's a much more intimate game at its core that revolves around personal relationships. It's an easy kind of game to empathize with and understand. Persona 3 Reload is an intimate kind of game in some other, possibly less appealing ways as well. This is a very long game. My playthrough took 79 hours, but its social and plot elements take place in a pretty small number of locations set in the fictional city of Tatsumi Port Island, There's no grand open world here, or even a broader set of discrete areas like we saw in Persona 5. I don't think it's a big issue necessarily, but it does date the game a bit, and I do think an expanded environment might have been an interesting avenue to explore. Tartarus is bound to be controversial as well. The combat gameplay in Persona 3 Reload takes place almost exclusively within Tartarus, which is a sort of procedurally generated dungeon with hundreds of floors. Reload mixes it up a bit by giving the party members spoken dialogue and adding new gameplay elements like the challenging but optional monad encounters. But it's far from the handcrafted dungeons that are present in Persona 5. Boss fights also tend to be a little on the simpler side, largely eschewing the kinds of multi-stage encounters that are featured in other Atlas games. I would have appreciated more in the way of the higher production value cutscenes as well, which come in the form of anime sequences as well as high-fidelity pre-rendered 3D. It does seem like these appear more sporadically than in the original, with the game often leaning more on simpler 3D dioramas instead. Persona games aren't known for especially lavish narrative content, but there are a few sequences that I really think should have received a bit more attention. But I do have to say that as I got further and further into the game, those concerns, and some quibbles with the game's lighting, faded into the background, and I just really enjoyed what it had to offer. This game comes in at number 2 in large part because I really sort of feel like it was made for me, with just about every element meshing well with my own personal tastes. From the voice acting to the interface, to the music, to the combat, it all basically aligns with the kinds of systems and content that I tend to like in games. Persona 3 is one of my favorite 6th gen RPGs, and Persona 3 Reload has easily become one of my favorites on 9th gen consoles. I'm really eager to see what Atlas does with the next proper mainline Persona title, but Reload is an excellent RPG that's well worth playing. Number 1. Astrobot. My favorite thing about Astrobot is how tactile it is. That starts with the haptic feedback, which is just superb. Whether you're walking through tall grass, pulling a gigantic zipper, or pushing around a pile of skulls, every in-game action is perfectly translated to a convincing controller response. It's up there with the absolute best on the PS5, including 2020's Astro's Playroom. But that wouldn't mean much without convincing visuals to match. The traditional game animation is great, of course, and is top-notch for a 3D platformer. But it's the way those animations combine with real-time physics that really stands out. Astrobot is constantly smashing bits of the scenery and tearing enemies into bits, and that's all accompanied by very plausible-looking physics simulation, sometimes involving hundreds of objects. The game often sets up big physics moments as a kind of reward for the player, but everything from small-scale particle interactions to gigantic show-stopping set pieces looks correct. When everything in the environment responds physically to the player, it gives pleasing real-time feedback that is often missing from other modern titles, which are frequently constrained by more realistic visuals and baked lighting. There's no real limit to scale here, no point at which objects conspicuously no longer have physics acting on them, even when the scale dwarfs anything I can remember seeing in a video game. The platforming mechanics are also pulled off near perfectly. The basic moveset is tight, responsive, and finely tuned, and each special ability feels unique and is easily understood. Just controlling Astro is a joy, and deaths never really feel unfair. Stages are designed quite inventively, introducing new abilities and developing the player's capacity with those powers through progressive challenges. The PlayStation IP-based worlds stand out the most, like the Ape Escape and God of War planets, but I don't think there's a bad one in the bunch. Astrobot does a great job of throwing new thing after new thing after new thing at you, but not in an overwhelming way, and the production values in each stage impress. There's very little sit-back cinematic content though. The big moments are almost entirely fully playable. These stages generally progress in a push-forward fashion, which is a very sensible way to design a 3D platformer. It's not quite as linear as something like Super Mario 3D World, but it's not as open as Super Mario Odyssey, despite some structural similarities. There's never any question about where you need to go to progress. The camera rarely needs manual tweaking, and the platforming challenges tend to not involve a lot of lateral movement. Astrobot's technical character is also pretty great. The assets generally survive point-blank scrutiny, with high polygonal budgets and good-looking textures. Lighting tends to be a bit on the simpler side, with indirect lighting in particular perhaps a little underdeveloped, but it generally looks attractive and clean. Plus, the game renders at a very stable 60 FPS in its sole visual mode, with great image quality. It ends up resembling older CG as a result, with a smooth, clean look, generally free of obvious real-time rendering gremlins. My only slight annoyances concern the controls. While the haptics are excellent, the game's heavy use of adaptive triggers was fatiguing, and I turned them off quickly. Gyro controls are typically used tastefully enough, like for controlling the DualSense ship, but can prove a bit tiring during certain sequences. There is an option to use the left stick as an alternative for the gyroscope, but this was sometimes not sensitive enough for some sections. And the game's camera is a little languid, and there's no ability to increase camera sensitivity, though it usually doesn't need a right stick adjustment. Overall though, I think Astrobot is a tremendous accomplishment on just about every level. It's up there in my mind with some of the best 3D platformers ever made, and it easily takes my number one spot for 2024. Overall, I think 2024 was a pretty solid year for game software, at least judged by my own personal preferences. There were a few other games I enjoyed this year that fell outside of my top 5, like Helldivers 2 and Space Marine 2. Looking ahead to 2025, I'm excited for Doom: The Dark Ages, Metroid Prime 4, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, and GTA 6, alongside certain key remasters like Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. It looks like a pretty good year for gaming at the moment, though some titles are bound to slip, as Bloodlines did last year. I'm also very much looking forward to the Nintendo Switch 2. The PS5 Pro launch provided a lot of enjoyment and work for me over the past few months, but a new platform release is even better. I'm hoping to see new entries from key Nintendo series alongside great looking 8th gen ports, and hopefully some decent current gen ports as well. In particular, a full new Mario Kart entry would be outstanding. So here's hoping that 2025 brings some quality gaming. And as always, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.